Welcome, friend, to this peaceful journey through time where we'll explore one of history's most remarkable transformations. Tonight, we follow the extraordinary path of a young woman who defied every expectation of her era to become the only female emperor in China's vast history. Whether you're settling in for the evening or seeking a gentle escape from the day's demands, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time with us. Have you ever wondered how a 14-year-old girl with no political connections could systematically outmaneuver the most powerful men in the world's largest empire? The answer lies not in luck or circumstance, but in an intelligence so sharp and a will so determined that it would reshape an entire civilization. What I'm about to reveal will take you inside the hidden world of Tang Dynasty palace life, where every conversation was a negotiation, every meal a potential poisoning, and every friendship a calculated alliance. This isn't just the story of political ambition. This is the chronicle of Zetian, a woman who understood that survival required becoming indispensable, that power demanded patience, and that ruling an empire meant mastering not just politics, but human nature itself. By the time our journey ends, you'll understand exactly how she achieved what countless men had attempted and failed to accomplish throughout Chinese history. But before we witness her coronation as emperor, we must begin where her story truly started. Not with her birth into a merchant family, but with her first morning inside the Forbidden City, when the 15-year-old concubine Wu Zhao woke to discover that everything she thought she knew about power was completely wrong. The pre-dawn darkness of the imperial palace carried sounds that no commoner would ever hear. The soft shuffle of silk slippers on marble floors as hundreds of servants began their daily rituals, the distant chanting of Buddhist monks preparing for morning prayers, the gentle splash of water as palace maids filled porcelain basins for the elaborate washing ceremonies that would consume the first 2 hours of every imperial day. Wu Zhao's eyes opened not to sunlight but to the flickering glow of oil lamps that burned continuously in the inner chambers of the Forbidden City. Even in sleep, she had learned to remain partially alert. In this place where whispered conversations could determine the fate of kingdoms, complete unconsciousness was a luxury that ambitious women simply could not afford. Her sleeping quarters, while luxurious by the standards of her merchant family background, were modest within the context of imperial grandeur. A single room with walls adorned in painted silk, depicting scenes of celestial maidens dancing among clouds. A bed of polished rosewood inlaid with jade flowers. A writing desk where she'd spent countless hours studying the classical texts that other concubines ignored as unnecessarily masculine pursuits. The morning routine began before she was fully awake. Her personal maid, a woman named Mei Lin, who had served in the palace for over a decade, entered silently and began preparing the elaborate series of garments that would transform Wu Zhao from a sleeping girl into a properly presented imperial concubine. First came the silk undergarments, each layer carefully selected for both comfort and the specific message it would send about her status within the complex hierarchy of palace women. As Mei Lin worked, she provided the daily intelligence briefing that had become essential to Wu Zhao's survival. Which officials had visited the emperor the previous evening? Which concubines had been summoned to imperial chambers? Which palace servants had been asking unusual questions about her activities? This information, gathered through the invisible network of maids, cooks, and guards who actually witnessed the inner workings of imperial power, was often more valuable than the formal reports that reached the emperor through official channels. The cosmetic preparation alone required nearly an hour, not the simple application of powder and rouge that merchant women might use, but an art form that transformed the face into a living representation of imperial aesthetics. White lead powder mixed with ground pearls created the porcelain complexion that symbolized refinement and distance from common labor. Eyebrows were plucked and redrawn into perfect arches that followed the mathematical proportions favored by court artists. Lips were painted in precise shapes using vermilion mixed with honey, creating colors that would remain perfect throughout 12-hour days of careful conversation and calculated smiles. But Wu Chao understood something that her fellow concubines seemed to miss entirely. The elaborate beauty rituals were not about vanity or even attraction. They were about transformation. Each morning, she was not simply getting dressed. She was constructing a persona carefully designed to serve her larger strategic objectives. The slight adjustment in eyebrow shape that made her appear more scholarly. The particular shade of lip color that suggested both sophistication and accessibility. The jewelry selections that demonstrated cultural knowledge, while avoiding any appearance of competing with higher-ranked women. The breakfast ritual provided her first opportunity each day to gather intelligence about the broader political currents flowing through the palace. The morning meal was served not in private chambers, but in communal dining halls, where concubines of similar rank shared tables and, inevitably, information. Wu Zhao had trained herself to eat slowly and speak little, allowing her to observe the complex social dynamics that revealed far more than any participant intended. She watched how certain women clustered together, forming alliances based on regional origins, or shared patrons among the court officials. She noted which concubines seemed anxious or distracted, often indicating that they had received troubling news about family members or political developments in their home provinces. Most importantly, she identified which women possessed information about the emperor's moods, preferences, and daily schedule that might prove useful for her own strategic planning. The conversations during these meals followed predictable patterns that Wu Zhao had learned to decode like a secret language. Complaints about the weather actually conveyed concerns about political climate. Discussions of poetry and literature served as vehicles for sharing gossip about court officials. Seemingly innocent questions about family news were often attempts to gather intelligence about regional politics that might affect imperial policies. After breakfast came the educational activities that distinguished Wu Zhao from virtually every other woman in the imperial household. While her fellow concubines spent mornings practicing music, embroidery, or other traditionally feminine accomplishments, Wu Zhao had somehow gained access to classical texts, historical chronicles, and even basic administrative documents that allowed her to understand how the imperial government actually functioned. This education had required extraordinary persistence and creativity. Women were not supposed to read military treatises or economic reports, but Wu Zhao had cultivated relationships with elderly scholars and junior officials who were willing to discuss these topics during carefully orchestrated encounters that appeared casual but were actually intensive tutorial sessions. She had memorized vast portions of classical literature, not for cultural refinement, but because these texts contained the philosophical frameworks that guided imperial decision-making. Her study sessions were conducted in a small garden pavilion that provided both privacy and the appearance of innocent recreation. To any observer, she was simply a young woman enjoying quiet contemplation among the flowering trees. In reality, she was analyzing historical precedents for the political challenges facing the current dynasty, studying the economic systems that sustained imperial power, and developing her understanding of the military strategies that protected Chinese territories from foreign invasions. The most challenging aspect of these educational pursuits was maintaining the appearance of feminine propriety while acquiring knowledge that was considered fundamentally masculine. Wu Zhao had learned to discuss complex political concepts using language and metaphors drawn from traditionally female domains. She could analyze military strategy by comparing battlefield tactics to embroidery patterns. She could critique economic policies by relating them to household management principles. This linguistic camouflage allowed her to demonstrate sophisticated understanding while avoiding accusations of inappropriate masculine behavior. The afternoon hours brought the most dangerous and potentially rewarding activities of each day. This was when Wu Zhao engaged in the careful relationship building that would determine her long-term prospects within the palace hierarchy. Unlike the morning intelligence gathering, which was primarily observational, afternoon activities required active participation in the complex social negotiations that governed palace life. She had identified several key constituencies whose support would be essential for her advancement. Junior court officials who possessed detailed knowledge of administrative procedures but lacked the political connections necessary for rapid promotion. Military officers who valued practical competence over aristocratic credentials. Senior servants whose decades of palace experience had given them encyclopedic understanding of imperial preferences and protocols. Each relationship required a different approach, carefully calibrated to the individual's personality and interests. The court officials responded to demonstrations of her administrative knowledge and her ability to provide insights into policy challenges. The military officers appreciated her genuine interest in strategic planning and her practical suggestions for improving operational efficiency. The senior servants valued her respectful recognition of their expertise and her willingness to learn from their accumulated wisdom. These relationship-building activities were conducted through seemingly casual encounters that were actually carefully orchestrated meetings designed to advance specific objectives. A chance conversation in a garden pathway that allowed her to demonstrate knowledge of historical precedents relevant to current policy debates. An apparently spontaneous offer to help with administrative tasks that showcased her literacy and organizational skills. A respectful request for guidance about palace protocols that created opportunities for senior servants to share valuable information about imperial preferences. The evening hours brought the culmination of each day's efforts in the form of potential encounters with the emperor himself. These opportunities were rare and unpredictable, making preparation both essential and incredibly challenging. Wu Zhao might have minutes or hours of advance notice before being summoned to imperial chambers for conversations that could range from casual entertainment to serious policy discussions. She had studied the emperor's documented preferences, moods, and interests with the intensity of a military strategist preparing for crucial battles. She knew which topics energized him and which ones caused him to lose interest. She understood his decision-making patterns and the types of advice he found most valuable. Most importantly, she had learned to recognize the subtle signals that indicated whether he wanted intellectual stimulation, emotional support, or simply pleasant distraction from the burdens of imperial responsibility. These evening encounters required her to demonstrate the full range of skills she had been developing during her months in the palace. The cultural knowledge that allowed her to discuss poetry and philosophy with genuine sophistication. The political understanding that enabled her to offer meaningful insights into governmental challenges. The emotional intelligence that helped her provide the specific type of companionship that the emperor needed on any particular evening. But perhaps most challenging was maintaining the delicate balance between usefulness and deference that imperial protocol demanded. She needed to be interesting enough to capture and hold the emperor's attention, knowledgeable enough to contribute meaningfully to serious discussions, and ambitious enough to advance her own position within the palace hierarchy. Yet she also had to remain appropriately humble, respectful of established precedents, and careful never to appear to be overstepping the boundaries that separated concubines from genuine political advisors. As night fell over the forbidden city and oil lamps cast dancing shadows on painted walls, Wu Zhao would reflect on the day's accomplishments and setbacks, while planning strategies for the challenges that tomorrow would inevitably bring. Each day brought new opportunities to advance her position, but also new risks that could destroy everything she had worked to achieve. The young woman who had entered the imperial palace as a powerless teenager was systematically transforming herself into something unprecedented in Chinese history. Not just a favored concubine, but a genuine political force whose intelligence and strategic thinking were becoming indispensable to the functioning of imperial government. But Wu Zhao understood that her current progress, however impressive, was merely the foundation for far greater ambitions that would require even more audacious strategies and even greater risks. The daily routines of palace life were teaching her lessons about power, patience, and political survival that would prove essential when she faced challenges that no woman in Chinese history had ever attempted to overcome. The months that followed would test every skill Wu Zhao had developed in the delicate art of imperial survival. As winter gave way to spring in the Forbidden City, she began to notice subtle changes in the palace atmosphere that signaled approaching challenges to everything she had built during her careful ascent through the concubine hierarchy. The first warning came through the network of servants whose loyalty she had cultivated with such patience and precision. Mei Lin arrived for the morning preparations carrying more than the usual intelligence about court activities. Her movements were more deliberate, her voice lower than usual as she began the ritual of transforming Wu Zhao for another day of strategic maneuvering. The emperor had been spending increasing amounts of time in private consultation with his most senior advisors, discussing matters that were kept secret, even from his closest personal attendants. These discussions invariably involved the question of imperial succession and the growing pressure from court officials who believed that the dynasty's future required more traditional approaches to selecting imperial wives and designated heirs. Wu Zhao listened to this information while Mei Lin applied the morning cosmetics, but her mind was already racing through the implications and potential responses. She had always known that her irregular status as a recalled concubine made her vulnerable to political changes, but she had hoped that her demonstrated usefulness would provide sufficient protection against factional opposition. The breakfast gathering that morning revealed additional troubling signs that confirmed her growing concerns about the stability of her position. Several of the higher-ranked concubines were displaying subtle changes in behavior that suggested they had received information about imperial decisions that had not yet been announced publicly. Their conversations carried an undercurrent of anticipation, mixed with careful positioning that indicated major changes were approaching. Wu Zhao maintained her usual pattern of quiet observation, while mentally cataloguing every gesture, every glance, every seemingly innocent comment that might provide clues about the nature of the challenges she would soon face. The women who had previously treated her with respectful deference were now watching her with expressions that suggested they believed her influence was about to diminish significantly. The morning study session provided a welcome escape from the increasingly tense social dynamics of the concubine quarters. In the privacy of her garden pavilion, Wu Zhao could focus on the intellectual pursuits that had become both her greatest source of strength and her most effective method of stress management. Today, she was reviewing historical accounts of previous succession crises, searching for patterns and precedents that might guide her response to whatever developments were approaching. The classical texts offered numerous examples of court officials who had successfully navigated political transitions by demonstrating their indispensable value to new rulers, but they also contained cautionary tales about individuals who had overestimated their security and failed to adapt quickly enough to changing political circumstances. Wu Zhao absorbed these lessons while formulating contingency plans for several possible scenarios that might unfold in the coming weeks. Her afternoon relationship-building activities took on new urgency as she worked to strengthen alliances that might prove crucial during the approaching crisis. The junior court officials, who had become accustomed to her administrative insights, were now receiving more intensive cultivation as Wu Zhao provided them with increasingly valuable information and practical assistance that would create stronger bonds of mutual dependence. The military officers, whose respect she had earned through her strategic understanding, found themselves engaged in more detailed discussions about imperial security challenges and potential solutions that showcased her continuing relevance to imperial governance. Wu Zhao understood that demonstrating her ongoing usefulness was essential for maintaining support during periods when her formal status might be questioned or challenged. The senior servants, whose accumulated wisdom had become so valuable to her own strategic planning, were now receiving more systematic attention as Wu Zhao worked to ensure their continued loyalty regardless of changes in her official position within the palace hierarchy. These relationships, built on genuine respect and mutual benefit, represented her most reliable source of protection against the factional politics that dominated court life. The evening hours brought confirmation of her worst fears when she received an unprecedented summons to meet with the emperor in his private study, rather than in the more informal settings where their conversations usually took place. The formal nature of the request, delivered through official channels rather than personal attendance, signaled that this would be a conversation about policy rather than companionship. Wu Zhao spent the brief preparation time reviewing everything she knew about the emperor's current concerns and potential decisions that might affect her status. She selected her clothing and jewelry with particular care, choosing items that conveyed both respect for imperial authority and confidence in her own continuing value to the dynasty's success. The walk through the palace corridors to the emperor's private study felt longer than usual, as Wu Zhao mentally rehearsed potential responses to various scenarios that might unfold during their conversation. The formal guards posted outside the study confirmed that this was indeed an official meeting rather than a casual social encounter. Emperor Gaozong was seated behind an elaborate desk covered with official documents when Wu Zhao entered with the precise combination of dignity and deference that palace protocol required. His expression was serious but not hostile, suggesting that while the conversation would address significant issues, her immediate safety was not in jeopardy. The emperor began by acknowledging the valuable contributions Wu Zhao had made to imperial administration during her time in the palace, particularly her insights into policy challenges and her assistance with various governmental projects. This recognition provided some reassurance that her efforts had been noticed and appreciated at the highest levels of imperial authority. However, Emperor Gaozong continued. The current political situation required him to consider changes in palace arrangements that would address concerns raised by senior court officials about traditional protocols and proper procedures for imperial governance. The pressure from aristocratic families and conservative advisors had reached levels that threatened the stability of his administration if left unaddressed. Wu Zhao listened to this explanation with careful attention while formulating her response to what was clearly a warning about impending changes to her status within the imperial household. She recognized that the emperor was providing her with advance notice of decisions that had already been made, allowing her time to prepare for transitions that could not be prevented but might be managed to minimize damage to her long-term prospects. Her response demonstrated the diplomatic skills and political intelligence that had enabled her remarkable rise within the palace hierarchy. Wu Zhao expressed gratitude for the emperor's consideration and acknowledged the validity of concerns about maintaining proper protocols and traditional procedures that had served the dynasty well throughout its history. At the same time, she carefully presented arguments about the practical benefits that her continued service could provide to imperial administration, emphasizing her unique qualifications and demonstrated track record of successful contributions to governmental effectiveness. She avoided any appearance of challenging the emperor's authority, while making clear that removing her entirely would represent a loss of valuable resources for imperial governance. The conversation that followed revealed the emperor's own conflicted feelings about the political pressures he was facing and his genuine appreciation for Wu Zhao's capabilities. He acknowledged that the decision to modify her status was driven primarily by factional politics, rather than concerns about her competence or loyalty to imperial interests. This acknowledgement provided Wu Zhao with crucial information about the emperor's true attitudes and the possibility that future changes in political circumstances might create opportunities for her to regain and even expand her influence within the imperial system. The conversation was ending, not with her complete elimination from palace life, but with a strategic retreat that preserved possibilities for future advancement. The final portion of their discussion focused on practical arrangements that would manage the transition while protecting both Wu Zhao's immediate welfare and the emperor's long-term interests. These arrangements demonstrated the emperor's continuing respect for her abilities and his recognition that their relationship might prove valuable under different political circumstances. As Wu Zhao left the emperor's private study and walked back through the corridors toward her quarters, she began processing the implications of what she had learned and formulating strategies for the challenging period that lay ahead. The conversation had confirmed her fears about immediate threats to her position, but it had also revealed opportunities that a less perceptive person might have missed entirely. The days that followed would test every lesson she had learned about patience, adaptability, and strategic thinking during her time in the Forbidden City. The young woman who had transformed herself from powerless concubine to imperial advisor was about to discover whether her remarkable skills were sufficient to survive the most dangerous challenge of her extraordinary career. But Wu Zhao had not spent years mastering the complex arts of palace politics without developing contingency plans for exactly this type of crisis. The setback she was facing, while serious, was not necessarily permanent, and the intelligence, determination, and political skills that had brought her this far would soon prove capable of achieving transformations that even she had not previously imagined possible. The morning after her crucial meeting with Emperor Gaozong brought a silence to Wu Zhao's chambers that felt heavier than the usual pre-dawn stillness. Mei Lin entered with movements more cautious than usual, her face carrying the carefully neutral expression that palace servants perfected when navigating dangerous political currents. The daily transformation ritual proceeded with its familiar precision, but both women understood that they were preparing for a performance that might be among the last of its kind. Each layer of silk, each brushstroke of cosmetic, each carefully selected ornament carried additional weight as Wu Zhao constructed what might be her final appearance as an active participant in imperial court life. The breakfast gathering revealed that news of her changed circumstances had already begun circulating through the invisible communication networks that connected every corner of the Forbidden City. The subtle shifts in seating arrangements, the carefully averted gazes, the conversations that paused when she approached, all confirmed that her fellow concubines had received word about her impending transition to a different status within the palace hierarchy. Wu Zhou maintained her composure throughout the meal, but her mind was cataloguing every reaction, every gesture, every word that might provide insight into how various factions were positioning themselves in response to her altered circumstances. Some women displayed barely concealed satisfaction at her apparent downfall. Others seemed genuinely concerned about losing a source of protection and advancement. A few appeared to be calculating whether maintaining their association with her might prove beneficial or dangerous in the changed political environment. The morning study session took on new significance as Wu Zhao realized that her access to classical texts and historical documents might soon be restricted or eliminated entirely. She spent extra time reviewing accounts of previous court figures who had successfully managed similar transitions, searching for strategies that might enable her own survival and eventual resurgence. The historical precedents offered both hope and warning. Several examples existed of individuals who had lost imperial favor temporarily, but later returned to positions of even greater influence through patient strategic maneuvering. However, these success stories were balanced by numerous cautionary tales of court figures who had miscalculated their options and disappeared entirely from historical records. Wu Zhao's afternoon activities focused intensively on securing the relationships and information sources that would be essential for maintaining any prospect of future political relevance. The conversations with junior court officials became more direct as she worked to establish forms of communication that could continue even after her formal status changed. These discussions required delicate balance between demonstrating continuing value and avoiding any appearance of plotting against imperial decisions. The military officers, whose respect she had cultivated, proved particularly valuable during this critical period. Their professional focus on practical competence over court politics made them more willing to maintain relationships based on demonstrated capability rather than formal rank. Wu Zhou used these conversations to position herself as a potential resource for future strategic challenges that might require her unique combination of analytical skills and administrative experience. Her meetings with senior palace servants took on the character of intensive intelligence briefings as Wu Zhao worked to understand the full scope of changes being implemented and the timeline for various transitions. These conversations revealed that her situation, while serious, was not unique. Several other court figures were facing similar adjustments, as Emperor Gaozong responded to pressure from conservative factions demanding more traditional approaches to imperial governance. The evening brought an unexpected development that would prove crucial to Wu Zhao's long-term survival. Rather than the formal dismissal she had been preparing for, she received word that her transition would take the form of temporary assignment to Buddhist religious observances. This arrangement provided face-saving cover for all parties while preserving possibilities for future changes in her status. The Buddhist monastery where Wu Zhao would spend the coming months was located within the imperial complex, allowing her to maintain some connection to palace life while officially withdrawing from active participation in court politics. This arrangement was far preferable to complete exile, which would have eliminated any prospect of eventual return to imperial service. Wu Zhao spent her final evening in the concubine quarters, carefully destroying documents and personal items that might be used against her by political enemies while preserving materials that could prove valuable for future strategic planning. The process of sorting through accumulated possessions became an exercise in evaluating which aspects of her palace experience would remain relevant during her period of religious contemplation. The clothing and jewelry that had been so carefully selected for their political messaging would be replaced by simple Buddhist robes. The cosmetics and personal ornaments that had transformed her appearance each morning would give way to the austere presentation expected of religious devotees. Even her daily schedule would shift from the complex social negotiations of court life to the structured routines of monastic observation. But Wu Zhao understood that this transition, while representing a significant setback, also offered unexpected opportunities for the type of strategic thinking and planning that had enabled her remarkable rise within the imperial hierarchy. The enforced isolation of religious life would provide time for intensive study and reflection that might prove more valuable than continued participation in the increasingly constrained environment of court politics. The Buddhist monastery where she would spend the coming months maintained extensive libraries containing not only religious texts, but also historical chronicles and philosophical treatises that could enhance her understanding of imperial governance and political strategy. The scholarly monks who supervised religious instruction possessed knowledge and perspectives that differed significantly from the court officials and military advisors who had been her primary sources of education. Most importantly, the temporary nature of her religious assignment meant that she could use this period to develop new capabilities and relationships while maintaining her long-term objective of returning to active participation in imperial governance. The months ahead would test her patience and adaptability, but they would also provide opportunities for growth and preparation that might prove essential for achieving even greater success upon her eventual return. The morning of her departure from the concubine quarters began before dawn with final preparations that were conducted with unusual formality. Mei Lin helped her don the simple grey robes that would replace her elaborate court costumes, a transformation that was both symbolically significant and practically challenging. The woman who had spent months perfecting the art of imperial presentation was now learning to find dignity and presence in deliberate simplicity. The walk from her chambers to the monastery compound took her through sections of the Forbidden City that she had rarely visited during her time as a concubine. The Buddhist complex occupied gardens and courtyards that were designed for contemplation rather than political maneuvering, offering perspectives on imperial life that were impossible to gain from within the competitive environment of the court. The head abbess who welcomed Wu Zhao to the monastery was a woman of remarkable intelligence and spiritual authority, whose own background included connections to several previous imperial courts. This relationship would prove invaluable as Wu Zhao began adapting to religious life while maintaining her broader strategic objectives. The daily routine in the monastery began with pre-dawn meditation sessions that required a form of mental discipline quite different from the constant alertness and social calculation that had characterized her court experience. The practice of sustained contemplation challenged Wu Zhao to develop new forms of self-control and awareness that would enhance her already formidable analytical capabilities. The morning religious instruction provided exposure to Buddhist philosophical concepts that offered fresh perspectives on questions of power, authority, and social responsibility that were central to imperial governance. The teachings emphasized compassion, wisdom, and skillful action in ways that complemented and extended the Confucian and Taoist principles she had studied during her palace education. The afternoon work assignments in the monastery gardens and kitchens created opportunities for conversations with other women who had chosen or been assigned to religious life for various reasons. These interactions provided Wu Zhao with insights into different approaches to surviving and thriving within institutional constraints, knowledge that would prove relevant to her eventual return to imperial service. The evening study periods allowed Wu Zhao to continue her intensive reading of historical and philosophical texts, while developing deeper understanding of Buddhist approaches to leadership and social organization. The monastic library contained works that were not available in the court collections, including accounts of successful female leaders from other cultures and time periods that offered inspiration and practical guidance. The weeks that followed established patterns of religious observance and scholarly study that enabled Wu Zhao to maintain her intellectual development while adapting to dramatically different social circumstances. The enforced simplicity of monastic life created space for reflection and planning that had been impossible during the constant demands of court politics. The monastery's location within the imperial complex meant that Wu Zhao could maintain awareness of political developments through carefully managed information networks that connected religious communities to broader palace activities. This intelligence capability allowed her to track changes in court dynamics while positioning herself for eventual re-engagement with imperial governance. The relationships she developed with other residents of the monastery included women whose own experiences with court life provided valuable perspectives on survival strategies and political opportunities. These conversations enhanced Wu Zhao's understanding of the complex factors that influenced imperial decision-making, while expanding her network of potential allies and information sources. The months of religious life were transforming Wu Zhao in ways that went far beyond the temporary change in her formal status within the imperial hierarchy. The combination of spiritual discipline, intensive study, and enforced patience was creating new dimensions of capability and understanding that would prove essential for the even greater challenges that awaited her return to active political life. The young woman who had entered the monastery as a temporarily displaced concubine was developing into something far more formidable and sophisticated. The skills and knowledge she was acquiring during this period of apparent setback would soon enable achievements that would astound even those who had witnessed her remarkable initial rise within the imperial court. But Wu Zhao understood that her time in religious contemplation was merely preparation for the next phase of her extraordinary journey toward ultimate power. The lessons she was learning about patience, strategy, and human nature would prove indispensable when she faced challenges that would make her previous court experiences seem simple by comparison. The seasons changed within the monastery walls, marking time not through the elaborate court ceremonies that had once structured Wu Zhao's days, but through the subtle shifts in garden blooms and the changing patterns of light that filtered through paper windows during morning meditation sessions. Spring arrived with the delicate fragrance of jasmine blossoms that reminded her of the perfumed courtyards she had left behind. Yet the simplicity of monastic life had begun to reveal depths of understanding that court luxury had never provided. Her daily routine had evolved into a rhythm that served multiple purposes beyond the obvious religious observances. The pre-dawn meditation sessions, initially challenging for a mind accustomed to constant political calculation, had become opportunities for a different kind of strategic thinking. In the stillness before sunrise, Wu Zhao found herself able to process information and develop plans with a clarity that the constant distractions of court life had never allowed. The morning chanting sessions provided cover for careful observation of the other women who shared her temporary exile from the world of imperial politics. Several were daughters of disgraced officials who had been placed in religious life to protect family honor during political transitions. Others were widows of military commanders whose knowledge of frontier affairs remained politically sensitive despite their official withdrawal from worldly concerns. Each woman carried information and connections that Wu Zhao catalogued with the same systematic attention she had once applied to court gossip. The breakfast preparation duties in the monastery kitchens created unexpected opportunities for intelligence gathering that proved more valuable than many of her previous palace sources. The servants who delivered supplies from the imperial household often lingered to share news about court developments with the religious staff who prepared meals. Wu Zhao learned to time her kitchen assignments to coincide with these deliveries, allowing her to maintain current awareness of political changes while appearing completely absorbed in religious duties. The mid-morning scripture study sessions challenged her to apply the analytical skills she had developed through classical Chinese literature to Buddhist philosophical concepts that offered surprisingly relevant insights into questions of power and governance. The teachings about skillful means and compassionate action provided frameworks for thinking about leadership that complemented her existing knowledge, while suggesting new approaches to the challenges she would eventually face upon returning to political life. The afternoon garden work assignments placed Wu Zhao in outdoor courtyards, where carefully positioned listening posts allowed her to overhear conversations between visiting officials and senior monastery administrators. These discussions often revealed information about imperial policy debates and personnel changes that was not available through other sources. The physical labor of tending plants and maintaining pathways provided perfect cover for systematic eavesdropping on politically significant conversations. The early evening periods designated for personal reflection became intensive planning sessions where Wu Zhao reviewed the intelligence she had gathered throughout the day while developing contingency strategies for various scenarios that might affect her future prospects. The enforced solitude of religious life created ideal conditions for the type of comprehensive strategic thinking that had enabled her initial success in palace politics. The communal dinner preparations required cooperation with women, whose diverse backgrounds provided Wu Zhao with perspectives on imperial governance that extended far beyond the court-centered viewpoints she had previously encountered. Former provincial administrators shared insights about regional political dynamics. Daughters of merchant families contributed understanding of economic factors that influenced imperial policy. Widows of frontier commanders offered knowledge of military challenges that shaped strategic planning. These conversations, conducted while performing simple tasks like chopping vegetables or arranging serving dishes, created an informal educational environment that was in many ways more valuable than the formal instruction Wu Zhao had received from court tutors. The women spoke freely about subjects that would have been dangerous to discuss within the politically charged atmosphere of the imperial palace, allowing for honest analysis of governmental strengths and weaknesses. The evening religious instruction sessions provided exposure to Buddhist concepts of interdependence and impermanence that offered fresh perspectives on the political challenges she had observed during her court experience. The teachings emphasized that all conditions were temporary and that skillful action required understanding the constant flow of changing circumstances rather than attempting to establish permanent control over dynamic situations. These philosophical insights proved particularly relevant to Wu Zhao's analysis of her own situation and the broader political environment she would eventually rejoin. The recognition that her current religious assignment was temporary encouraged patience, while the understanding of constant change suggested that new opportunities would inevitably arise for those prepared to recognize and act upon them. The nighttime study periods in the monastery library provided access to historical accounts and philosophical treatises that were not available in the court collections. Wu Zhao discovered biographical accounts of successful female leaders from various periods of Chinese history whose experiences offered practical guidance for navigating the unique challenges faced by women seeking political authority in traditionally masculine environments. The library also contained diplomatic correspondence and military reports that provided insights into international relations and frontier security challenges that were essential background for understanding imperial strategic planning. Wu Zhao absorbed this material with the same intensity she had once applied to court gossip, recognizing that comprehensive knowledge of external threats and opportunities would be crucial for demonstrating her continuing value to imperial governance. The winter months brought a deepening of her religious practices that was accompanied by increasingly sophisticated political analysis of the information she continued to gather about court developments. The combination of spiritual discipline and intellectual rigor was creating new dimensions of capability that went far beyond anything Wu Zhao had possessed during her previous period of palace service. The meditation practices were enhancing her ability to remain calm and focused during stressful situations, while the philosophical studies were providing frameworks for understanding complex political dynamics that would prove invaluable when she eventually returned to active participation in imperial governance. The enforced simplicity of monastic life was teaching lessons about essential versus superficial forms of power that would inform her future strategic planning. The relationships she had developed with other monastery residents were creating networks of information and potential support that extended throughout the imperial system. Former court ladies maintained connections to active political figures. Daughters of military families possessed knowledge of frontier conditions and strategic challenges. Women from merchant backgrounds understood economic factors that influenced imperial policy decisions. The spring of her second year in religious life brought subtle indications that political circumstances were beginning to shift in ways that might create opportunities for her eventual return to active court service. The information reaching the monastery suggested that Emperor Gaozong was facing new challenges that might require the type of administrative expertise and analytical capabilities that Wu Zhao had previously demonstrated. The changes were gradual and initially appeared insignificant to casual observers, but Wu Zhao recognized patterns in the intelligence reports that suggested growing dissatisfaction with some of the conservative advisors who had influenced her original assignment to religious life. The practical difficulties of governing a vast empire with traditional methods were apparently creating pressure for more innovative approaches to administrative challenges. The military situation along the northern frontiers was requiring strategic planning capabilities that emphasized practical effectiveness over aristocratic credentials. Economic developments in the southern provinces were creating policy challenges that demanded understanding of commercial dynamics rather than classical literary knowledge. Diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms were becoming increasingly complex in ways that required analytical skills and cultural sophistication rather than simple adherence to traditional protocols. Each of these developments represented potential opportunities for Wu Zhao to demonstrate the continuing relevance of her capabilities to imperial governance. The knowledge and skills she had developed during her period of religious contemplation had enhanced rather than diminished her potential value to the emperor's administration. The challenge would be finding appropriate ways to signal her availability and preparedness without appearing to violate the religious commitments that had provided her protection during this transitional period. The summer months brought more definitive indications that her period of monastic exile was approaching its natural conclusion. The head abbess began engaging Wu Zhao in conversations about her future plans that suggested official discussions were taking place about her potential return to active service. These conversations required careful balance between expressing readiness for worldly responsibilities while maintaining appropriate respect for religious commitments. The preparation for her eventual transition back to court life began with gradual modifications to her daily routine that would ease the adjustment from monastic simplicity to imperial complexity. The meditation practices that had become central to her spiritual development would continue, but they would be supplemented with renewed attention to the political and social skills that would be essential for success in the competitive environment of palace life. The relationships she had cultivated during her religious period would be maintained through carefully structured communication networks that could provide continuing sources of information and support. The women she had come to know in the monastery represented a diverse collection of backgrounds and connections that could prove valuable for future strategic planning. The knowledge she had gained through intensive study of historical accounts, philosophical treatises, and contemporary political developments had created a foundation of understanding that was far more comprehensive than anything she had possessed during her initial period of court service. The combination of practical experience, theoretical knowledge, and spiritual discipline was creating capabilities that would enable achievements far beyond anything she had previously accomplished. The autumn of her second year in religious life brought the formal notification that her period of Buddhist contemplation was concluding and that she would be returning to active participation in imperial governance. The announcement came through official channels that indicated her recall was the result of imperial decision rather than personal request, providing appropriate face-saving cover for all parties involved. The final weeks in the monastery were spent in intensive preparation for the transition back to court life that would require her to demonstrate immediately her continuing value to imperial administration while adapting to whatever changes had occurred during her absence. The woman who had entered religious life as a temporarily displaced concubine was preparing to emerge as something far more formidable and capable than anyone could have anticipated. The morning of her departure from the monastery began with meditation sessions that had become as natural as breathing, followed by final conversations with the women whose friendships had sustained her through the most challenging period of her extraordinary journey. The simple grey robes that had marked her religious status were replaced by court garments that signalled her return to active political life, but the inner transformation that had occurred during her monastic period would prove far more significant than any external change in appearance. The walk from the monastery compound back to the imperial palace took her through gardens and courtyards that were familiar yet somehow different after nearly 2 years of absence. The forbidden city appeared smaller than she remembered, perhaps because her perspective had expanded during her period of contemplation and study. The complex political dynamics that had once seemed overwhelming now appeared manageable challenges that could be addressed through patient strategic thinking and skillful action. The woman who returned to imperial service in the winter of her 24th year possessed capabilities and understanding that far exceeded anything she had brought to her original palace appointment. The intelligence and determination that had enabled her initial success had been enhanced by spiritual discipline, comprehensive education, and strategic patience that would prove essential for the even greater challenges and opportunities that awaited her in the next phase of her remarkable ascent toward ultimate power. D. Ultimate power. Emperor Gaozong was facing challenges that required precisely the type of analytical intelligence and administrative competence that Wu Zhao had spent years developing. The frontier rebellions in the Western territories demanded strategic planning that went beyond traditional military responses. The economic disruptions caused by flooding in the southern provinces required innovative approaches to tax collection and resource distribution. Most significantly, the diplomatic complications arising from Korean territorial disputes needed someone who could navigate complex international relationships while protecting Chinese interests. Wu Zhao's first morning back in imperial service began before dawn with preparations that felt both familiar and strange after her monastic simplicity. The elaborate cosmetic rituals that had once consumed hours now seemed almost quaint compared to the inner transformation she had undergone during her religious contemplation. Yet, she understood that these external presentations remained essential components of court politics that required careful attention despite their superficial nature. The silk garments that replaced her simple grey robes carried messages about status and intention that would be read and interpreted by every person she encountered during her first day back in the imperial hierarchy. The jewelry selections communicated cultural sophistication and political awareness. The precise arrangement of her hair followed protocols that demonstrated respect for established traditions, while subtly indicating her readiness to engage with contemporary challenges. The morning intelligence briefing provided by her personal servants revealed the extent to which palace dynamics had shifted during her absence. Several of the conservative officials who had opposed her original elevation had been transferred to provincial positions after their policy recommendations proved inadequate for addressing current governmental challenges. New faces occupied key administrative roles, creating opportunities for fresh relationships that were not burdened by previous factional conflicts. The breakfast gathering in the imperial dining halls provided her first direct exposure to the changed social environment that would define her renewed court experience. The women who had once viewed her with mixture of envy and calculation now regarded her return with curiosity and caution that reflected uncertainty about her current status and future prospects within the imperial hierarchy. Wu Zhao navigated these social complexities with skills that had been sharpened by her monastic experience of observing human nature without the distractions of personal ambition or competitive pressure. The spiritual practices that had become second nature allowed her to remain centered and focused while processing the subtle communications that filled every conversation and gesture around the imperial breakfast tables. The morning audience with Emperor Gaozong took place in his private study, the same location where they had discussed her transition to religious life nearly 2 years earlier. The emperor's appearance showed the effects of the governmental challenges he had faced during her absence, but his greeting conveyed genuine satisfaction at her return and immediate eagerness to benefit from her analytical capabilities. Their conversation began with his description of the multiple crises that were testing imperial administrative systems in ways that traditional approaches seemed inadequate to address. The Korean situation had evolved into a complex diplomatic and military challenge that required someone who could develop comprehensive strategies, addressing both immediate tactical concerns and long-term regional stability. Wu Zhao listened to these explanations while mentally cataloguing the information and beginning to formulate preliminary approaches to the various challenges the emperor described. Her responses demonstrated that her period of religious contemplation had enhanced rather than diminished her capability for strategic thinking and practical problem-solving. The emperor's relief at having access to her analytical skills again was evident in his immediate assignment of her to review the Korean policy options that his other advisors had developed. This task provided Wu Zhao with an opportunity to demonstrate immediately her continuing value while establishing her credibility with the new officials who had joined the imperial administration during her absence. The afternoon work session, reviewing diplomatic correspondence and military reports, revealed the complexity of the Korean situation and the limitations of the approaches that had been pursued during her religious assignment. The traditional strategies favored by aristocratic advisors had proven inadequate for addressing the sophisticated political dynamics that characterized contemporary international relations. Wu Zhao's analysis identified several opportunities for innovative approaches that combined diplomatic initiatives with carefully calibrated military preparations in ways that could advance Chinese interests while avoiding the costly conflicts that previous policies had risked. Her recommendations demonstrated understanding of regional politics, economic factors, and cultural considerations that impressed even skeptical officials who had questioned the wisdom of her recall. The evening discussion of her policy proposals with Emperor Gaozong and his senior advisors provided Wu Zhao with her first formal opportunity to establish her position within the reconfigured imperial administration. The meeting took place in the council chamber, where the most important governmental decisions were made through collaborative discussions among the emperor's most trusted advisors. Her presentation of alternative approaches to the Korean challenge showcased analytical capabilities that had been enhanced by her intensive study during the monastic period, while demonstrating practical understanding of implementation challenges that reflected her previous administrative experience. The combination of theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom created a compelling case for policy innovations that addressed current challenges more effectively than existing approaches. The questions and discussions that followed her presentation revealed both the strengths and limitations of the other officials who comprised the emperor's advisory circle. Wu Zhao was able to identify potential allies who shared her preference for pragmatic solutions over ideological purity, while recognizing sources of opposition that would require careful management in future policy debates. The emperor's decision to adopt several of her Korean policy recommendations provided immediate validation of her continuing value to imperial governance, while establishing expectations for her future role in addressing other administrative challenges. The success of this initial assignment would be crucial for determining whether her return to court life would enable advancement beyond her previous position or merely restore her former status. The weeks that followed brought a series of additional assignments that tested Wu Zhao's capability across the full range of imperial administrative responsibilities. The southern flood recovery required coordination between central government resources and local implementation capabilities in ways that demanded both economic understanding and practical management skills. Her approach to the flood relief challenge demonstrated how her monastic experience had enhanced her ability to work with diverse constituencies whose cooperation was essential for successful policy implementation. The spiritual practices that had taught her patience and compassion proved valuable for building relationships with provincial officials whose support was crucial for effective resource distribution. The Western frontier rebellions presented different but equally complex challenges that required integration of military strategy with economic development and cultural diplomacy. The tribal leaders who were challenging Chinese authority had legitimate grievances about trade policies and administrative practices that needed to be addressed alongside the immediate security concerns created by armed resistance. Wu Zhao's analysis of the frontier situation identified root causes of the rebellions that had been overlooked by purely military approaches to the problem. Her recommendations for economic incentives and cultural accommodations provided alternatives to costly military campaigns while addressing the underlying issues that had motivated tribal opposition to Chinese authority. The success of these policy initiatives established Wu Zhao's reputation as an administrative innovator, whose approaches achieved better results at lower costs than traditional methods favored by aristocratic advisors. Her growing influence within the Imperial Council created opportunities for addressing larger questions about governmental effectiveness and administrative reform. The spring months brought recognition that her recall from religious life had been motivated by more than immediate crisis management needs. Emperor Gaozong was beginning to contemplate comprehensive reforms to imperial administration that would require systematic changes to established procedures and personnel policies that had governed Chinese governance for generations. These reform discussions provided Wu Zhao with opportunities to contribute to fundamental questions about governmental organization and policy implementation that went far beyond the specific crisis management assignments she had initially received. Her participation in strategic planning sessions established her as a key figure in the emperor's long-term vision for administrative modernization. The relationship she developed with reform-minded officials during this period created a political coalition that shared commitment to practical effectiveness over traditional protocol. These alliances would prove essential as resistance to administrative innovations emerged from conservative factions who viewed governmental changes as threats to their established privileges and influence. The summer brought the first major test of Wu Zhao's renewed political position, when conservative officials launched coordinated opposition to the Korean policy initiatives she had developed. Their criticism focused on the unprecedented nature of her diplomatic approaches and questioned the propriety of allowing someone with her irregular status to influence crucial international negotiations. Wu Zhao's response to this challenge demonstrated how her monastic experience had enhanced her political skills while teaching her new forms of patience and strategic thinking. Rather than engaging in direct confrontation with her critics, she focused on documenting the practical success of her policy recommendations while building support among officials who valued results over precedent. The emperor's decision to maintain support for her Korean policies, despite conservative opposition, provided crucial validation of her position within the imperial administration, while sending clear signals about his priorities regarding governmental effectiveness versus traditional protocols. This support established precedents that would prove important for future challenges to her growing influence. The autumn months brought expanded responsibilities that reflected Wu Zhao's demonstrated competence and the emperor's increasing reliance on her analytical capabilities. Her assignment to review and recommend reforms to the imperial examination system provided opportunities to address fundamental questions about governmental personnel policies and administrative efficiency. The examination system reform she proposed would create new pathways for talented individuals from diverse backgrounds to enter imperial service while maintaining appropriate standards for governmental competence. These changes would strengthen administrative capabilities while reducing the influence of aristocratic families whose power depended on hereditary access to key positions. The winter of her first year back in active service concluded with formal recognition of Wu Zhao's contributions through appointment to an advisory position that acknowledged her essential role in imperial decision-making. The appointment carried unprecedented authority for someone with her background, while establishing expectations for even greater responsibilities in the future. The young woman who had returned from monastic life with enhanced capabilities and deepened understanding was systematically transforming herself into an indispensable component of imperial governance. The intelligence and determination that had enabled her initial success had been strengthened by spiritual discipline and comprehensive education that prepared her for challenges that would test every skill she had developed. But Wu Zhao understood that her current achievements, however significant, were merely foundations for even greater ambitions that would require strategies and capabilities beyond anything she had previously attempted. The next phase of her extraordinary journey would demand not just administrative competence and political skill, but the vision and courage necessary to reshape fundamental assumptions about power and authority in Chinese civilization. The woman who had entered the imperial court as a powerless teenager was preparing to attempt transformations that no one in Chinese history had ever achieved. The lessons learned during her monastic contemplation would prove essential as she faced challenges that would either establish her as one of history's most remarkable leaders or serve as cautionary tales about the limits of individual ambition in traditional societies. The morning audiences with Emperor Gaozong had evolved into collaborative planning sessions where Wu Zhao's insights shaped imperial policy across the full spectrum of governmental responsibilities. These daily meetings provided her with comprehensive understanding of administrative challenges while establishing her authority over policy development in ways that impressed even former critics who had questioned her qualifications. The emperor's growing dependence on her analytical capabilities was creating opportunities for Wu Zhao to influence fundamental decisions about imperial governance that would have lasting effects on Chinese civilization. Her recommendations were consistently proving more effective than alternatives proposed by traditional advisors, building a track record of success that justified expanding her responsibilities even further. Further, the collaborative planning sessions had become the foundation of imperial decision-making, with Wu Zhao's voice carrying equal weight to senior ministers who had decades of governmental experience. The emperor's morning routine now included mandatory consultation with her on matters ranging from provincial tax collection to diplomatic correspondence with foreign courts. This unprecedented access to imperial authority was creating possibilities that Wu Zhao had never dared imagine during her early years of careful political maneuvering. The daily intelligence briefings she received from her expanded network of informants provided comprehensive awareness of political currents throughout the empire. Former monastery contacts maintained connections to regional administrators and military commanders, whose loyalty had been cultivated through years of practical assistance and genuine respect for competence over aristocratic privilege. These relationships created information channels that bypassed traditional bureaucratic hierarchies while providing more accurate assessments of actual conditions in distant provinces. The morning correspondence review revealed the extent to which imperial governance had become dependent on Wu Zhao's analytical capabilities. Provincial governors submitted reports directly to her for preliminary analysis before they reached the emperor. Military commanders requested her strategic assessments of frontier situations that required integration of diplomatic, economic, and tactical considerations. Even foreign ambassadors had begun requesting audiences with her, alongside their formal meetings with imperial officials. The breakfast conferences with reform-minded officials had evolved into systematic planning sessions for comprehensive administrative modernization that would transform Chinese governmental systems in ways that reflected contemporary realities rather than historical traditions. These discussions addressed fundamental questions about imperial authority, bureaucratic efficiency, and social organization that had profound implications for the future development of Chinese civilization. Wu Zhao's influence over these reform discussions was creating opportunities to implement changes that would strengthen imperial governance while expanding possibilities for talented individuals from diverse backgrounds to contribute to governmental effectiveness. The examination system modifications she had proposed were already producing measurable improvements in administrative competence while reducing the influence of hereditary privilege over policy decisions. The midday policy implementation meetings provided Wu Zhao with direct oversight of governmental operations that extended throughout the imperial system. Her recommendations were being translated into specific directives that affected millions of Chinese subjects, while establishing new precedents for how imperial authority could be exercised more effectively than traditional methods had achieved. The afternoon diplomatic sessions required Wu Zhao to navigate increasingly complex international relationships that demanded sophisticated understanding of cultural differences, economic interests, and strategic considerations that influenced neighboring kingdoms and tributary states. Her approaches to these challenges were consistently producing better results than conventional diplomatic protocols, while avoiding the costly conflicts that previous policies had risked. The Korean territorial negotiations had become a showcase for Wu Zhao's innovative diplomatic methods that combined cultural sensitivity with strategic firmness in ways that protected Chinese interests while respecting legitimate concerns of neighboring populations. The success of these negotiations was establishing her reputation throughout the region as someone whose word could be trusted and whose agreements would be honored regardless of changing political circumstances. The evening strategic planning sessions addressed long-term challenges that would determine the future stability and prosperity of the Chinese empire. Wu Zhao's participation in these discussions was shaping imperial policy for generations to come, while establishing principles of governance that emphasized practical effectiveness over traditional ceremony. The military modernization programs she had initiated were producing improvements in frontier defense capabilities that enabled more effective responses to external threats while reducing the financial burdens that military campaigns had traditionally imposed on imperial resources. These reforms were creating professional officer corps whose loyalty was based on demonstrated competence rather than family connections or regional origins. The economic development initiatives that Wu Zhao had designed were generating increased imperial revenues while improving living conditions for farming and artisan communities whose productivity sustained the entire governmental system. These programs demonstrated that effective imperial policy could simultaneously strengthen central authority and benefit ordinary subjects whose welfare had often been neglected by previous administrations. The winter months brought recognition that Wu Zhao's influence over imperial governance had reached levels that required formal acknowledgement through official titles and ceremonial recognition that reflected her actual authority over policy development and implementation. The emperor's decision to grant her unprecedented formal status within the governmental hierarchy marked a transformation that would have seemed impossible during her initial years as a powerless concubine. The appointment ceremonies that elevated Wu Zhao to her new official position were conducted with traditional formality that emphasized continuity with established precedents while acknowledging the revolutionary nature of what was occurring. The assembled court officials witnessed the creation of governmental authority that had no historical parallel in Chinese administrative systems. The responsibilities that accompanied Wu Zhao's formal elevation included direct oversight of multiple governmental departments whose coordination was essential for effective imperial administration. Her authority extended from economic policy development to military strategic planning, creating comprehensive influence over the systems that sustained Chinese civilization. The daily routine that emerged from her new official status required Wu Zhao to balance multiple competing demands while maintaining the analytical focus that had enabled her remarkable ascent through the imperial hierarchy. The morning audiences with department heads provided opportunities to coordinate policy implementation across the full spectrum of governmental activities. The correspondence management that consumed significant portions of her daily schedule included communications with provincial administrators, military commanders, diplomatic representatives, and court officials whose cooperation was essential for translating imperial decisions into practical results. These exchanges required careful attention to individual personalities and regional circumstances that influenced policy effectiveness. The afternoon council meetings where Wu Zhao participated in collective decision-making with the emperor's senior advisors had become collaborative sessions that reflected her essential role in imperial governance. Her voice carried equal authority with ministers whose appointments dated back decades, while her recommendations consistently proved more effective than alternatives proposed by traditional officials. The policy development work that occupied her evening hours involved comprehensive analysis of complex challenges that required integration of multiple perspectives and competing priorities. The solutions she developed addressed immediate practical concerns while establishing frameworks for addressing similar challenges in the future. The spring brought new tests of Wu Zhao's governmental authority when regional rebellions in the southwestern provinces required coordinated responses that combined military action with diplomatic negotiations and economic incentives. Her management of this complex crisis demonstrated the effectiveness of her administrative innovations while establishing precedents for future imperial responses to similar challenges. The military campaigns that she coordinated achieved their strategic objectives while minimizing casualties and financial costs that traditional approaches would have required. The diplomatic initiatives that accompanied military operations addressed root causes of regional discontent while preserving imperial authority and local autonomy in ways that satisfied competing interests. The economic reconstruction programs that Wu Zhao implemented in the aftermath of the southwestern crisis created lasting improvements in regional prosperity, while strengthening connections between provincial populations and central imperial authority. These initiatives demonstrated that effective governance could transform potential sources of instability into foundations for long-term imperial strength. The summer months brought international recognition of Wu Zhao's governmental innovations when foreign kingdoms began requesting her mediation of regional disputes that had previously required costly military interventions. Her diplomatic methods were producing peaceful resolutions to conflicts that had threatened regional stability while establishing Chinese influence in ways that benefited all parties involved. The diplomatic conferences that she conducted with representatives from multiple kingdoms created new frameworks for international cooperation that reduced tensions while expanding opportunities for mutually beneficial trade relationships. These achievements were establishing Wu Zhao's reputation as a leader whose innovations could address challenges that traditional approaches had failed to resolve. The autumn brought formal recognition from Emperor Gaozong that Wu Zhao's contributions to imperial governance had become indispensable for maintaining the effectiveness and stability of Chinese administration. Their collaborative relationship had evolved into genuine partnership, where her insights shaped fundamental decisions about the future direction of imperial policy. The daily collaboration between Emperor and his most trusted advisor had created governmental effectiveness that exceeded anything achieved by previous administrations, while establishing new standards for imperial leadership that emphasized practical results over ceremonial tradition. Their working relationship demonstrated how individual competence could enhance rather than threaten established authority. The winter ceremonies that marked the conclusion of Wu Zhao's third year back in active governmental service included recognition of achievements that had transformed imperial administration while preparing foundations for even greater innovations that would reshape Chinese civilization according to her expanding vision of effective governance. The woman who had returned from monastic contemplation with enhanced capabilities and deepened understanding, had systematically established herself as an essential component of imperial authority, whose influence extended throughout the Chinese governmental system. The intelligence and determination that had enabled her initial success had been augmented by spiritual discipline and comprehensive experience that prepared her for challenges requiring unprecedented leadership capabilities. The evening reflections that concluded each day of intensive governmental responsibility provided Wu Zhao with opportunities to assess progress toward long-term objectives that extended beyond immediate administrative concerns to encompass fundamental questions about imperial authority and social organization. The meditation practices that had sustained her during monastic isolation continued to provide clarity and focus essential for managing complex competing demands. The personal transformation that had occurred during her years of governmental service was creating capabilities that exceeded anything she had possessed during her initial period of palace life. The combination of practical experience, theoretical knowledge, and spiritual insight was generating wisdom and effectiveness that would prove essential for the ultimate challenges that awaited her in the next phase of her extraordinary journey toward supreme authority. The morning preparations that began each day of governmental responsibility had evolved into rituals that reflected Wu Zhao's transformed status while maintaining connection to the disciplines that had enabled her remarkable development. The simple meditation practices that preceded her formal daily activities provided centering and clarity that enhanced her analytical capabilities throughout demanding schedules. The intelligence networks that provided daily briefings on political developments throughout the empire had expanded to include sources in every significant governmental department and regional administrative center. This comprehensive awareness of imperial conditions enabled Wu Zhao to anticipate challenges and opportunities that less informed officials could not recognize until circumstances had already crystallized. The morning conferences with department administrators had become systematic coordination sessions that ensured imperial policies were implemented consistently across vast geographical distances and diverse local circumstances. Wu Zhao's oversight of these activities created governmental effectiveness that exceeded anything achieved by previous administrative systems. The correspondence that arrived each morning included communications from provincial governors, military commanders, diplomatic representatives, and court officials whose reports provided detailed understanding of conditions throughout the Chinese Empire. Wu Zhao's analysis of this information shaped imperial responses to emerging challenges while identifying opportunities for beneficial policy innovations. The midday council sessions, where imperial policy was developed through collaborative discussion, had evolved into strategic planning meetings that addressed long-term challenges, requiring comprehensive approaches that integrated military, diplomatic, economic, and administrative considerations. Wu Zhao's contributions to these discussions consistently provided insights that enhanced governmental effectiveness. The afternoon implementation meetings, where policy decisions were translated into specific administrative actions, required Wu Zhao to coordinate activities across multiple governmental departments while ensuring that imperial directives achieved intended results without creating unintended complications. Her management of these processes demonstrated capabilities that exceeded those of traditional administrative officials. The evening strategic assessments that concluded each day of governmental activity provided opportunities for Wu Zhao to evaluate progress toward long-term objectives while identifying adjustments that would improve policy effectiveness. These reflective practices had become essential components of her approach to imperial administration. The relationships she had developed with reform-minded officials throughout the imperial system were creating political coalitions that supported comprehensive administrative modernization while maintaining respect for beneficial traditional practices. These alliances provided essential support for innovations that challenged established precedents. The opposition that continued to emerge from conservative factions was being systematically addressed through demonstrations of practical effectiveness that made resistance to her policies appear counterproductive to imperial interests. Wu Zhao's approach to managing political opposition emphasized results over confrontation while building broader support for governmental innovations. The spring brought new opportunities for Wu Zhao to demonstrate leadership capabilities that extended beyond administrative competence to encompass the vision and strategic thinking necessary for addressing fundamental challenges facing Chinese civilization. The policies she developed were establishing precedents that would influence imperial governance for generations to come. The success of her governmental innovations was creating expectations for even greater responsibilities that would test every skill she had developed while requiring capabilities that no previous Chinese leader had been called upon to demonstrate. The next phase of her remarkable journey would demand not just administrative excellence, but the wisdom and courage necessary to reshape basic assumptions about imperial authority and social organization. The woman who had transformed herself from powerless concubine to indispensable governmental advisor was preparing for challenges that would either establish her as one of history's most extraordinary leaders or provide cautionary lessons about the limits of individual ambition in traditional societies. The intelligence, determination, and capabilities that had brought her to this unprecedented position would soon be tested in ways that would determine not just her personal destiny, but the future course of Chinese imperial development. The daily rhythms that governed Wu Zhao's life had evolved into something far more complex than the ceremonial routines that occupied other court figures. Each morning began with a private audience in Emperor Gaozong's personal chambers, where maps of the empire covered every available surface, and reports from distant provinces created towers of silk-wrapped documents that required immediate attention. The emperor's health had begun showing subtle signs of decline that were invisible to casual observers, but unmistakable to someone who spent hours each day in close consultation with him. The slight tremor in his hands when reviewing military dispatches, the moments of confusion when discussing complex policy details that had once held his complete attention, the increasing frequency with which he deferred to Wu Zhao's judgment on matters that he would previously have decided independently. These changes created both opportunities and dangers that Wu Zhao navigated with the careful precision that had characterized her entire political career. The emperor's growing dependence on her analytical capabilities was expanding her influence in ways that had never been formally acknowledged, yet any appearance of manipulating his condition would provide her enemies with devastating ammunition for attacking her unprecedented position. The morning intelligence briefings now included medical reports from the imperial physicians who attended Emperor Gaozong's private health examinations. Wu Zhao had cultivated relationships with these medical professionals through years of demonstrating genuine concern for the emperor's welfare, while providing them with administrative support that enhanced their ability to serve imperial health needs effectively. The information she received through these medical channels enabled her to adjust her daily interactions with the emperor in ways that accommodated his physical limitations, while maintaining the appearance of his continued authority over imperial decision-making. When his concentration wavered during lengthy policy discussions, she would suggest breaks that appeared motivated by her own needs rather than his condition. The careful management of imperial schedules had become one of Wu Zhao's most delicate responsibilities as she worked to ensure that Emperor Gaozong's public appearances maintained the dignity and authority that imperial protocol required, while avoiding situations that might reveal his declining capabilities to potential political opponents who could exploit any perception of weakness. The morning correspondence reviews had expanded to include sensitive communications that the emperor found increasingly difficult to process independently. Wu Zhao would read these documents aloud during their private meetings, providing summaries and analysis that enabled him to make informed decisions without struggling through lengthy written materials that exhausted his limited energy. The diplomatic correspondence from Korean kingdoms required particularly careful handling, as ongoing territorial negotiations demanded responses that demonstrated both imperial strength and sophisticated understanding of complex regional politics. Wu Zhao had effectively taken over these communications while maintaining the appearance that all decisions originated with Emperor Gaozong's direct authority. The midday council meetings had been restructured to accommodate the emperor's reduced stamina while ensuring that essential governmental business continued without interruption. Wu Zhao would conduct preliminary discussions with individual ministers before formal sessions, allowing her to coordinate positions and identify potential problems that could be resolved without exhausting the emperor's limited capacity for managing conflicts. The afternoon implementation sessions, where imperial policies were translated into specific administrative actions, had become Wu Zhao's primary venue for exercising direct authority over governmental operations. Her oversight of these activities was so comprehensive that provincial administrators throughout the empire had begun submitting reports directly to her for preliminary review before they reached the emperor. The evening audiences that concluded each day of imperial business provided Wu Zhao with opportunities for private conversations with Emperor Gaozong that addressed both immediate policy concerns and longer-term strategic planning. These intimate discussions had become the foundation for governmental decision-making, as the emperor increasingly relied on her judgment for guidance about complex challenges. The personal relationship that had developed between emperor and advisor during these evening sessions transcended the formal protocols that governed their public interactions. Wu Zhao's genuine concern for Emperor Gaozong's health and welfare had created bonds of trust and mutual respect that enabled unprecedented collaboration in managing imperial responsibilities. The winter months brought increased challenges as the emperor's condition continued its gradual decline, while external pressures from frontier rebellions and diplomatic crises demanded strong imperial leadership. Wu Zhao found herself managing an increasingly complex balancing act between supporting the emperor's authority and ensuring effective governmental responses to urgent challenges. The Korean territorial negotiations reached a critical phase that required decisive imperial action to prevent military conflicts that could destabilize the entire region. Wu Zhao's diplomatic innovations had created opportunities for peaceful resolution, but implementing these solutions required sustained attention and sophisticated strategic thinking that exceeded the emperor's current capabilities. Her management of the Korean crisis demonstrated how effectively she had learned to exercise imperial authority while maintaining the appearance of serving as the emperor's advisor rather than acting independently. The solutions she developed were consistently attributed to Emperor Gaozong's wisdom, while their practical implementation reflected her comprehensive understanding of regional politics and cultural dynamics. The success of the Korean negotiations established Wu Zhao's reputation throughout the imperial system as someone whose capabilities exceeded those of traditional administrators, while her loyalty to Emperor Gaozong remained absolutely unquestioned. These achievements created political capital that would prove essential for addressing even greater challenges that were approaching. The spring brought new crises that tested Wu Zhao's ability to manage imperial governance during a period when the emperor's condition made sustained attention to complex problems increasingly difficult. The southwestern provincial rebellions required coordinated military and diplomatic responses that demanded comprehensive strategic planning and careful implementation across vast geographical distances. Wu Zhao's approach to managing these rebellions demonstrated how her years of governmental experience had created capabilities that extended far beyond administrative competence to encompass genuine leadership skills. Her coordination of military campaigns with economic development initiatives achieved strategic objectives while minimizing costs and casualties that traditional approaches would have required. The daily routine that had evolved during this period of increased responsibility required Wu Zhao to balance multiple competing demands while maintaining the careful attention to the emperor's condition that enabled their continued collaboration. Her morning preparations now included reviews of medical reports alongside intelligence briefings and policy documents. The personal meditation practices that had sustained her throughout her remarkable career became even more essential during this period of unprecedented responsibility. The spiritual disciplines learned during her monastic years provided clarity and focus that enabled her to manage complex competing priorities while maintaining the emotional equilibrium necessary for effective decision-making. The evening reflections that concluded each day of intensive governmental activity included careful assessment of the emperor's condition and its implications for imperial governance. Wu Zhou understood that the current arrangements, however effective, represented a transitional phase that would eventually require more permanent solutions to ensure continued governmental stability. The relationships she had cultivated with key court officials, military commanders, and provincial administrators during her years of service were creating networks of support that would be essential for managing whatever transitions lay ahead. These alliances were based on demonstrated competence and mutual benefit rather than personal loyalty, creating more reliable foundations for long-term political stability. The opposition factions that continued to challenge Wu Zhao's influence were finding it increasingly difficult to mount effective resistance, as her governmental innovations consistently produced superior results compared to traditional administrative methods. Her track record of practical success was creating broader support for her policies while undermining arguments based solely on precedent and tradition. The summer months brought formal recognition that the governmental arrangements that had evolved during Emperor Gaozong's declining health had become the de facto system for imperial administration. Wu Zhao's authority over policy development and implementation was being acknowledged through official channels, even as the appearance of imperial decision-making was carefully maintained. The diplomatic conferences that she conducted with foreign representatives had established new standards for international negotiations that emphasized practical solutions over ceremonial protocols. Her methods were producing agreements that served Chinese interests while respecting legitimate concerns of neighboring kingdoms, creating regional stability that benefited all parties involved. The economic policies that Wu Zhao had implemented throughout the empire were generating increased revenues while improving conditions for the farming and artisan communities whose productivity sustained the entire governmental system. These achievements demonstrated that effective imperial administration could simultaneously strengthen central authority and benefit ordinary subjects. The military modernization programs that she had initiated were creating professional officer corps whose loyalty was based on merit and demonstrated competence rather than aristocratic connections or regional origins. These reforms were improving frontier defense capabilities while reducing the financial burdens that military campaigns had traditionally imposed on imperial resources. The autumn brought new challenges that would test every capability Wu Zhao had developed during her extraordinary journey, from powerless concubine to indispensable imperial advisor. The emperor's condition had reached levels that made continued public appearances increasingly difficult, creating pressure for arrangements that would ensure governmental continuity without triggering succession crises. The careful preparation for these inevitable transitions required Wu Zhao to navigate political complexities that exceeded anything she had previously encountered. The solutions she was developing would need to preserve imperial stability while acknowledging realities that had never been formally recognized in Chinese governmental systems. The winter ceremonies that marked another year of unprecedented governmental collaboration between emperor and advisor included recognition that their working relationship had created administrative effectiveness that exceeded anything achieved by previous imperial administrations. Their partnership had established new models for imperial leadership that emphasized practical results over traditional ceremony. The daily collaboration that had sustained imperial governance throughout this challenging period was approaching natural limits imposed by the emperor's declining health. Wu Zhao understood that the next phase of her remarkable career would require even greater capabilities and more audacious strategies than anything she had previously attempted. The woman who had systematically transformed herself from teenage concubine to essential governmental leader was preparing for challenges that would either establish her as one of history's most extraordinary rulers or provide cautionary lessons about the ultimate limits of individual ambition in traditional societies. The intelligence, determination, and capabilities that had brought her to this unprecedented position would soon be tested in ways that would determine the future course of Chinese imperial development. The morning audiences had become intimate planning sessions where Wu Zhao and Emperor Gaozong addressed fundamental questions about imperial succession and governmental continuity that would affect Chinese civilization for generations to come. Their discussions were creating frameworks for transitions that had no historical precedents while maintaining stability that was essential for imperial security. The correspondence that arrived each day included increasingly urgent communications from provincial administrators and military commanders, who recognized that effective imperial governance depended on Wu Zhao's continued authority over policy development and implementation. These officials were positioning themselves to support whatever arrangements would preserve the administrative effectiveness they had come to depend upon. The evening reflections that concluded each day of intensive preparation for inevitable transitions included careful consideration of the unprecedented nature of what Wu Zhao was contemplating. The transformation she was planning would require capabilities that exceeded anything any previous Chinese leader had been called upon to demonstrate, while challenging assumptions about imperial authority that had governed Chinese civilization for over 1,000 years. The spring of 661 brought a transformation in the daily rhythms of imperial life that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. Wu Zhao's morning preparations now began in chambers that adjoined the emperor's private quarters, a proximity that spoke volumes about her evolved status within the palace hierarchy. The silk garments laid out for her each dawn were no longer the carefully calculated costumes of an ambitious concubine, but the refined robes of someone whose presence was essential to the empire's daily functioning. The pre-dawn meditation that had sustained her through years of political maneuvering now served a different purpose. As she sat in the stillness before the palace awakened, Wu Zhao contemplated decisions that would affect millions of Chinese subjects. The breathing exercises that had once calmed her anxieties about survival were now techniques for maintaining clarity while managing the overwhelming complexity of imperial governance. Mei Lin's morning intelligence briefings had evolved into comprehensive situation reports that covered every aspect of imperial administration. The network of informants that had once focused on palace gossip now provided detailed assessments of military conditions along distant frontiers, economic developments in remote provinces, and diplomatic communications from foreign courts. Wu Zhao absorbed this information while completing the transformation rituals that prepared her for another day of unprecedented responsibility. The morning audience with Emperor Gaozong had become a collaborative planning session where they reviewed overnight communications and established priorities for the day's governmental activities. The emperor's increasing reliance on her analytical capabilities was evident in how he processed complex information, frequently pausing to seek her interpretation of reports that would have once held his complete attention. The breakfast period, once spent navigating the competitive dynamics of concubine social hierarchies, now involved meetings with department heads who arrived seeking guidance on implementation of imperial policies. Wu Zhao would review their reports while consuming simple meals, offering corrections and adjustments that reflected her comprehensive understanding of how governmental decisions affected conditions throughout the empire. The morning correspondence session had expanded to consume several hours, as Wu Zhao managed communications that flowed between the imperial court and administrative centers throughout Chinese territories. Provincial governors submitted detailed reports about local conditions that required her analysis before reaching Emperor Gaozong. Military commanders requested strategic guidance for frontier challenges that demanded integration of diplomatic, economic, and tactical considerations. The diplomatic correspondence required particularly careful attention as ongoing negotiations with Korean kingdoms, Turkish tribal confederations, and Central Asian trading partners demanded responses that balanced competing interests while protecting Chinese territorial and economic advantages. Wu Zhao had effectively become the primary architect of imperial foreign policy while maintaining the appearance that all decisions originated with Emperor Gaozong's direct authority. The midday council sessions where imperial policy was developed had been restructured to accommodate the collaborative working relationship that had evolved between emperor and his most trusted advisor. Wu Zhao would present preliminary analysis of complex challenges while facilitating discussions among ministers whose expertise covered different aspects of governmental administration. Her management of these council meetings demonstrated sophisticated understanding of bureaucratic psychology and group dynamics that enabled more effective decision-making than traditional hierarchical approaches had achieved. By encouraging genuine debate while maintaining clear authority structures, she created environments where the best ideas could emerge regardless of their sources, while ensuring that final decisions reflected comprehensive consideration of competing perspectives. The afternoon implementation sessions where imperial policies were translated into specific administrative actions had become Wu Zhao's primary venue for exercising direct oversight of governmental operations. Department heads would present detailed plans for executing policy decisions, while she provided guidance about potential complications and necessary modifications that reflected her understanding of local conditions throughout the empire. These sessions revealed the extent to which imperial administration had become dependent on Wu Zhao's analytical capabilities and comprehensive knowledge of governmental systems. Officials who had initially questioned her qualifications now sought her approval for initiatives that fell within their traditional areas of responsibility, recognizing that her insights consistently improved policy effectiveness. The late afternoon audiences with visiting officials from distant provinces provided Wu Zhao with opportunities to maintain direct contact with conditions throughout the empire, while building relationships with administrators whose cooperation was essential for effective policy implementation. These meetings required her to demonstrate familiarity with regional challenges and local customs that impressed even experienced governors who had served in remote territories for decades. The evening strategic planning sessions addressed long-term challenges that would determine the future stability and prosperity of Chinese civilization. Wu Zhao's participation in these discussions was shaping imperial policy for generations to come, while establishing principles of governance that emphasize practical effectiveness over traditional ceremony. The military modernization programs she had initiated were producing measurable improvements in frontier defense capabilities, while reducing the financial burdens that military campaigns had traditionally imposed on imperial resources. Her coordination with professional officers who valued competence over aristocratic credentials was creating more effective command structures that could respond rapidly to external threats. The economic development initiatives that Wu Zhao had designed were generating increased imperial revenues while improving living conditions for farming and artisan communities whose productivity sustained the entire governmental system. These programs demonstrated that effective imperial policy could simultaneously strengthen central authority and benefit ordinary subjects, whose welfare had often been neglected by previous administrations. The diplomatic innovations she had introduced were producing peaceful resolutions to regional conflicts that had previously required costly military interventions. Her methods emphasized cultural understanding and economic incentives alongside strategic firmness, creating agreements that satisfied competing interests while establishing Chinese influence in ways that benefited all parties involved. The evening hours brought private consultations with Emperor Gaozong that addressed both immediate policy concerns and fundamental questions about imperial succession and governmental continuity. These intimate discussions had become the foundation for decision-making as the emperor increasingly relied on Wu Zhao's judgment for guidance about challenges that exceeded his diminished capacity for sustained analysis. The personal transformation that had occurred during Wu Zhao's years of governmental service was evident in how she approached these evening conversations. The calculating ambition that had once driven her political maneuvering had evolved into genuine commitment to effective governance that served broader imperial interests rather than personal advancement. The meditation practices that concluded each day of intensive responsibility provided Wu Zhao with opportunities to process the enormous complexity of managing imperial administration while maintaining the emotional equilibrium necessary for sustained effectiveness. The spiritual disciplines learned during her monastic years had become essential tools for managing stress and maintaining perspective during periods of unprecedented challenge. The winter months brought recognition that the governmental arrangements that had evolved during this period represented permanent changes to imperial administration rather than temporary expedients. Wu Zhao's authority over policy development and implementation was being acknowledged through formal channels, even as careful attention was paid to maintaining appropriate ceremonial protocols. The daily routine that had emerged during this period required Wu Zhao to balance multiple competing demands, while maintaining the careful attention to Emperor Gaozong's condition that enabled their continued collaboration. The morning medical consultations with imperial physicians had become regular components of her schedule, as she worked to ensure that the emperor's declining health did not compromise governmental effectiveness. The correspondence management that consumed significant portions of her daily schedule included increasingly sensitive communications that reflected the empire's growing dependence on her analytical capabilities. Provincial administrators throughout Chinese territories had begun submitting reports directly to her for preliminary review, recognizing that her insights were essential for effective policy implementation. The afternoon coordination meetings, where different governmental departments synchronized their activities, had become systematic planning sessions that ensured imperial policies were implemented consistently across vast geographical distances and diverse local circumstances. Wu Zhao's oversight of these processes created administrative effectiveness that exceeded anything achieved by previous imperial systems. The evening audiences with court officials who required guidance about complex challenges had evolved into collaborative problem-solving sessions where Wu Zhao's expertise was combined with specialized knowledge from various governmental departments. These interactions demonstrated how her comprehensive understanding of imperial administration could enhance the capabilities of traditional bureaucratic structures. The relationships she had developed with reform-minded officials throughout the imperial system were creating political coalitions that supported comprehensive administrative modernization while maintaining respect for beneficial traditional practices. These alliances provided essential support for innovations that challenged established precedents while demonstrating practical benefits that justified departures from conventional approaches. The spring brought new opportunities for Wu Zhao to demonstrate leadership capabilities that extended beyond administrative competence to encompass the vision and strategic thinking necessary for addressing fundamental challenges facing Chinese civilization. The policies she developed were establishing precedents that would influence imperial governance for generations, while creating frameworks for continued innovation and adaptation. The success of her governmental innovations was creating expectations for even greater responsibilities that would test every skill she had developed while requiring capabilities that no previous Chinese leader had been called upon to demonstrate. The daily management of imperial administration had become preparation for challenges that would demand not just excellence in existing systems, but the wisdom and courage necessary to create entirely new approaches to governmental authority. The morning preparations that began each day now included reviews of succession planning documents that addressed the unprecedented nature of Wu Zhao's position within the imperial hierarchy. The legal and ceremonial frameworks that would be required for formalizing her authority were being developed through careful study of historical precedents and innovative interpretations of traditional protocols. The intelligence networks that provided daily briefings had expanded to include sources within every significant governmental department and regional administrative center throughout the empire. This comprehensive awareness of imperial conditions enabled Wu Zhao to anticipate challenges and opportunities that less informed officials could not recognize until circumstances had already crystallized into crises requiring immediate responses. The correspondence that arrived each morning included communications from foreign courts that increasingly recognized Wu Zhao as the primary architect of Chinese policy, despite her formerly subordinate position within the imperial hierarchy. Diplomatic representatives were requesting audiences with her alongside their formal meetings with traditional officials, acknowledging realities that had not yet been officially recognized. The midday policy development sessions had become comprehensive strategic planning meetings that addressed challenges requiring integration of military, diplomatic, economic, and administrative considerations across timeframes extending far beyond immediate concerns. Wu Chao's contributions to these discussions consistently provided insights that enhanced governmental effectiveness while establishing frameworks for addressing similar challenges in the future. The afternoon implementation oversight had evolved into direct management of governmental operations that extended throughout the Chinese administrative system. Her authority over policy execution was so comprehensive that department heads throughout the empire had begun coordinating their activities through her office rather than following traditional bureaucratic channels that had proven less effective. The evening strategic assessments that concluded each day of governmental activity provided opportunities for Wu Zhao to evaluate progress toward long-term objectives while identifying adjustments that would improve policy effectiveness. These reflective practices had become essential components of her approach to imperial administration while preparing her for even greater responsibilities that awaited in the next phase of her extraordinary journey. The woman who had transformed herself from powerless teenager to indispensable governmental leader was systematically preparing for challenges that would require every capability she had developed while demanding innovations that no previous ruler had attempted. The intelligence, determination, and comprehensive understanding that had brought her to this unprecedented position would soon be tested in ways that would determine not just her personal destiny, but the future course of Chinese imperial development. The daily rhythms that governed her life had become the foundation for governmental effectiveness that exceeded anything achieved by previous imperial administrations. Each morning brought new opportunities to demonstrate capabilities that justified her expanding authority, while each evening provided time for reflection and planning that prepared her for the ultimate transformation that was rapidly approaching. The meditation practices that had sustained her throughout her remarkable career were evolving into something deeper as Wu Zhao prepared for responsibilities that would exceed anything previously attempted by any Chinese leader. The spiritual disciplines that had provided clarity during periods of political uncertainty were now generating the wisdom and courage necessary for reshaping fundamental assumptions about imperial authority and governmental organization. The morning audiences had become planning sessions for transitions that would create entirely new frameworks for imperial governance while maintaining the stability and effectiveness that Chinese civilization required for continued prosperity. The conversations between emperor and advisor were addressing questions that had never been formally considered while developing solutions that would influence governmental development for centuries to come. The woman who had begun her journey as a merchant's daughter seeking survival in the Forbidden City was preparing to attempt achievements that would either establish her as one of history's most extraordinary leaders or provide cautionary lessons about the limits of individual ambition in traditional societies. The next phase of her remarkable transformation would test every skill she had mastered while requiring capabilities that would challenge the very foundations of Chinese imperial tradition. The autumn of 661 brought subtle changes in the morning light that filtered through the silk screens of Wu Zhao's chambers. The shadows fell differently now, as if the very architecture of the Forbidden City was adjusting to accommodate the unprecedented reality of her daily existence. The palace servants who attended her morning preparations moved with a deference that extended beyond mere protocol into genuine recognition of authority that transcended traditional hierarchies. The pre-dawn hours had become sacred time for contemplation that prepared Wu Zhao for days of decision-making that affected the lives of millions throughout the Chinese Empire. The meditation cushion where she sat each morning faced east toward the rising sun, but her thoughts traveled across vast distances to provincial capitals where her policies were being implemented and frontier outposts where her strategic decisions determined the safety of Chinese territories. The morning transformation ritual had evolved into something approaching ceremony, as layers of silk were arranged according to protocols that reflected her unique position within the imperial system. Each garment carried symbolic meaning that communicated messages about authority and accessibility to the diverse constituencies she would encounter during the day. The jewelry selections required careful consideration of cultural sensitivities and political implications that extended far beyond personal preference or aesthetic choice. Mei Lin's intelligence briefings now resembled military situation reports, as networks of informants throughout the empire provided detailed assessments of conditions that required immediate attention or long-term strategic planning. The information flow had become so comprehensive that Wu Zhao possessed more current knowledge about imperial affairs than many provincial governors who were responsible for implementing her policies in their respective regions. The morning correspondence session revealed the extent to which governmental communications had been restructured around Wu Zhao's analytical capabilities and decision-making authority. Provincial administrators submitted reports formatted according to her preferences for data presentation. Military commanders requested strategic guidance using terminology that reflected her approach to integrating diplomatic and tactical considerations. Foreign ambassadors composed diplomatic notes that acknowledged her role in policy development while maintaining appropriate ceremonial deference to Emperor Gaozong. The breakfast conferences with department heads had become systematic coordination meetings where Wu Zhao reviewed overnight developments while establishing priorities for the day's governmental activities. These sessions required her to process enormous amounts of information while making decisions that would influence economic conditions, military deployments, and diplomatic relationships throughout the known world. The mid-morning audiences with visiting officials from distant territories provided Wu Zhao with direct contact with conditions throughout the empire, while building relationships with administrators whose cooperation was essential for effective policy implementation. These meetings demanded comprehensive knowledge of regional challenges, local customs, and individual personalities that impressed even experienced governors who had served in remote provinces for decades. The diplomatic correspondence that occupied significant portions of her morning schedule required sophisticated understanding of international relationships that extended far beyond traditional Chinese cultural boundaries. The Korean territorial negotiations demanded responses that balanced competing historical claims with contemporary strategic realities. The Turkish tribal communications required integration of military intelligence with cultural anthropology and economic analysis that few court officials possessed. The policy development sessions that followed these diplomatic activities brought together Wu Zhao's comprehensive knowledge of imperial administration with specialized expertise from governmental departments whose coordination was essential for effective implementation. These collaborative meetings produced innovative solutions to complex challenges while maintaining appropriate respect for traditional procedures that retained practical value. The midday council meetings where major imperial decisions were made had been restructured to accommodate the collaborative working relationship between emperor and advisor that had evolved during recent years. Wu Zhao would present preliminary analysis of complex situations while facilitating discussions among ministers whose combined expertise covered every aspect of governmental responsibility. Her management of these council sessions demonstrated mastery of group dynamics and bureaucratic psychology that enabled more effective decision-making than hierarchical approaches had traditionally achieved. By encouraging genuine debate while maintaining clear authority structures, she created environments where innovative solutions could emerge from collective wisdom, while ensuring that final decisions reflected comprehensive consideration of competing perspectives and long-term implications. The afternoon implementation meetings, where imperial policies were translated into specific administrative actions, had become Wu Zhao's primary venue for exercising direct oversight of governmental operations throughout the Chinese Empire. Department heads would present detailed execution plans while she provided guidance about potential complications and necessary modifications that reflected her understanding of local conditions and cultural sensitivities. These sessions revealed how completely imperial administration had become dependent on Wu Zhao's analytical capabilities and comprehensive knowledge of governmental systems. Officials who had initially questioned her qualifications now sought her approval for initiatives that fell within their traditional areas of responsibility, recognizing that her insights consistently improved policy effectiveness while reducing implementation costs and unintended consequences. The late afternoon strategic planning sessions addressed long-term challenges that would determine the future stability and prosperity of Chinese civilization for generations to come. Wu Zhao's participation in these discussions was establishing precedents and principles that would influence imperial governance long after current participants had completed their service to the dynasty. The military modernization programs she had initiated were producing measurable improvements in frontier defense capabilities, while creating professional officer corps whose loyalty was based on demonstrated competence rather than aristocratic connections or regional origins. Her coordination with career soldiers, who valued practical effectiveness over traditional ceremony, was generating more responsive command structures that could adapt quickly to changing strategic circumstances. The economic development initiatives that Wu Zhao had designed throughout the empire were simultaneously increasing imperial revenues and improving living conditions for the farming and artisan communities whose productivity sustained the entire governmental system. These programs demonstrated that effective imperial policy could strengthen central authority while benefiting ordinary subjects whose welfare had often been neglected by previous administrations focused primarily on elite interests. The diplomatic innovations she had introduced were producing peaceful resolutions to regional conflicts that had previously required costly military interventions with uncertain outcomes. Her negotiation methods emphasized cultural understanding and economic incentives alongside strategic firmness, creating agreements that satisfied competing interests while establishing Chinese influence in ways that benefited all parties involved in complex international relationships. The evening hours brought private consultations with Emperor Gaozong that addressed both immediate policy concerns and fundamental questions about imperial succession and governmental continuity that would affect the dynasty's future development. These intimate discussions had become the foundation for strategic decision-making as the emperor increasingly relied on Wu Zhao's judgment for guidance about challenges that exceeded his diminished capacity for sustained analytical thinking. The personal conversations that concluded each day of intensive governmental collaboration revealed how their working relationship had transcended traditional protocols to become genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to effective imperial administration. The emperor's growing dependence on Wu Zhao's capabilities was balanced by her absolute loyalty to his authority and their collective responsibility for Chinese civilization's continued prosperity. The meditation practices that ended each day provided Wu Zhao with essential opportunities to process the enormous complexity of managing imperial administration while maintaining emotional equilibrium necessary for sustained effectiveness. The spiritual disciplines learned during her monastic years had become indispensable tools for managing stress and maintaining perspective during periods of unprecedented responsibility and political pressure. The evening reflections included careful consideration of the emperor's declining health and its implications for governmental continuity during a period when external challenges demanded strong imperial leadership. Wu Zhao understood that current arrangements, however effective, represented transitional solutions that would eventually require more permanent frameworks for ensuring administrative stability and policy consistency. The winter months brought formal recognition that the governmental systems that had evolved during recent years represented permanent changes to imperial administration rather than temporary expedients. Wu Zhao's authority over policy development and implementation was being acknowledged through official channels, while careful attention was paid to maintaining ceremonial protocols that preserved appropriate respect for established traditions. The daily schedules that had emerged during this period required Wu Zhao to balance multiple competing demands while maintaining careful attention to Emperor Gaozong's condition that enabled their continued collaboration. The morning medical consultations with imperial physicians had become regular components of her routine as she worked to ensure that the emperor's health limitations did not compromise governmental effectiveness or create opportunities for political exploitation. The correspondence management that consumed increasing portions of her daily activities included sensitive communications that reflected the empire's growing dependence on her analytical capabilities and strategic insights. Provincial administrators throughout Chinese territories had begun submitting reports directly to her for preliminary review, recognizing that her interpretations were essential for effective policy implementation and successful outcomes. The coordination meetings, where different governmental departments synchronized their activities, had become systematic planning sessions that ensured imperial policies were implemented consistently across vast geographical distances and diverse local circumstances. Wu Zhao's oversight of these processes created administrative effectiveness that exceeded anything achieved by previous imperial systems, while establishing new standards for governmental competence and efficiency. The relationships she had cultivated with reform-minded officials throughout the imperial system were creating political coalitions that supported comprehensive administrative modernization while maintaining respect for traditional practices that retained practical value. These alliances provided essential support for innovations that challenged established precedents, while demonstrating measurable benefits that justified departures from conventional approaches to governmental organization. The spring brought unprecedented opportunities for Wu Zhao to demonstrate leadership capabilities that extended beyond administrative competence to encompass the vision and strategic thinking necessary for addressing fundamental challenges facing Chinese civilization. The policies she developed were establishing frameworks for continued innovation and adaptation that would influence imperial governance for centuries, while creating models for effective leadership that transcended traditional gender limitations. The success of her governmental innovations was creating expectations for even greater responsibilities that would test every skill she had developed, while requiring capabilities that no previous Chinese leader had been called upon to demonstrate. The daily management of imperial administration had become preparation for challenges that would demand not just excellence in existing systems, but wisdom and courage necessary for creating entirely new approaches to governmental authority and social organization. The morning preparations that began each day now included reviews of succession planning documents that addressed the unprecedented nature of Wu Zhao's position within the imperial hierarchy and its implications for dynastic continuity. The legal frameworks and ceremonial protocols that would be required for formalizing her authority were being developed through careful study of historical precedents and innovative interpretations of traditional governmental procedures. The intelligence networks that provided comprehensive situation reports had expanded to include sources within every significant administrative center throughout the empire and beyond its borders. This systematic awareness of conditions throughout Chinese territories and neighboring kingdoms enabled Wu Zhao to anticipate challenges and opportunities that less informed officials could not recognize until circumstances had crystallized into situations requiring immediate responses and decisive action. The correspondence arriving each morning included communications from foreign courts that increasingly recognized Wu Zhao as the primary architect of Chinese policy, despite her formerly subordinate position within the traditional imperial hierarchy. Diplomatic representatives were requesting private audiences with her, alongside their ceremonial meetings with established officials, acknowledging political realities that had not yet received official recognition through formal governmental channels. The policy development sessions had evolved into comprehensive strategic planning meetings that addressed challenges requiring integration of military, diplomatic, economic, and administrative considerations across timeframes extending far beyond immediate concerns. Wu Zhao's contributions to these discussions consistently provided insights that enhanced governmental effectiveness while establishing sustainable frameworks for addressing similar challenges that would inevitably arise in the future. The implementation oversight had become direct management of governmental operations, extending throughout the Chinese administrative system, from the imperial capital to remote frontier outposts. Her authority over policy execution was so comprehensive that department heads throughout the empire coordinated their activities through her office rather than following traditional bureaucratic channels that had proven less effective for achieving desired outcomes. The evening strategic assessments that concluded each day of governmental activity provided opportunities for Wu Jiao to evaluate progress toward long-term objectives while identifying necessary adjustments that would improve policy effectiveness and administrative efficiency. These reflective practices had become essential components of her approach to imperial governance while preparing her for responsibilities that would soon exceed anything previously attempted by any Chinese ruler. The woman who had systematically transformed herself from merchant's daughter to indispensable governmental leader was preparing for challenges that would require every capability she had developed while demanding innovations that no previous emperor had conceived possible. The intelligence, determination, and comprehensive understanding that had brought her to this unprecedented position would soon be tested in ways that would determine not just her personal destiny, but the future direction of Chinese imperial development and governmental organization. The daily rhythms that had evolved during her years of service had become the foundation for administrative effectiveness that exceeded anything achieved by previous imperial governments, while establishing new standards for governmental competence and policy innovation. Each morning brought opportunities to demonstrate capabilities that justified her expanding authority, while each evening provided time for reflection and planning that prepared her for the ultimate transformation that was rapidly approaching. The meditation practices that sustained her throughout this remarkable journey were evolving into something deeper as Wu Jiao prepared for responsibilities that would exceed anything previously attempted by any Chinese leader in the empire's long history. The spiritual disciplines that had provided clarity during periods of political uncertainty were now generating the wisdom and courage necessary for reshaping fundamental assumptions about imperial authority, governmental organization, and social structure that had governed Chinese civilization for over a millennium. The spring of 662 marked the beginning of what historians would later recognize as the most audacious political transformation in Chinese imperial history. Wu Jiao's morning rituals now began in chambers that overlooked the central courtyard where emperors had walked for centuries. Yet her presence there represented something entirely without precedent in the vast chronicles of dynastic rule. The pre-dawn meditation that centered her thoughts each morning had evolved beyond personal spiritual practice into preparation for decisions that would reshape the fundamental nature of Chinese governance. As she sat in stillness before the palace stirred to life, Wu Jiao contemplated not merely the day's administrative challenges, but the revolutionary changes she was methodically implementing in the very structure of imperial authority. The transformation ritual that followed required nearly 2 hours, as teams of attendants arranged layers of silk that conveyed messages about power and accessibility to every person she would encounter. The deep purple robes with golden phoenix embroidery spoke of imperial dignity. The jade ornaments positioned at precise angles communicated cultural sophistication. Even the fragrance selected for her garments carried political significance, chosen to evoke memories of classical poetry that educated officials would immediately recognize and interpret. Mei Lin's morning briefings now resembled comprehensive intelligence reports that covered every aspect of imperial administration, from frontier military conditions to economic developments in remote provinces. The network of informants that provided this information had grown so sophisticated that Wu Jiao often possessed more current knowledge about regional affairs than the governors responsible for managing those territories. The breakfast period brought a steady stream of department heads seeking guidance on policy implementation, their respectful demeanor reflecting the reality that effective governance throughout the empire had become dependent on her analytical capabilities. These officials would present complex challenges while she consumed simple meals of rice porridge and steamed vegetables, offering solutions that demonstrated her comprehensive understanding of how governmental decisions affected conditions across vast geographical distances. The morning correspondence session revealed how completely imperial communications had been restructured around Wu Jiao's decision-making authority. Reports from provincial administrators arrived formatted according to her specifications for data presentation. Military commanders composed strategic assessments using frameworks she had developed for integrating diplomatic considerations with tactical planning. Foreign diplomatic representatives crafted their communications to acknowledge her central role in policy development while maintaining ceremonial deference to traditional protocols. The mid-morning audiences with visiting officials from distant territories had become essential mechanisms for maintaining direct contact with conditions throughout the empire, while building relationships with regional administrators, whose cooperation was crucial for effective governance. These meetings required Wu Zhao to demonstrate detailed knowledge of local customs, historical grievances, and individual personalities that impressed even experienced governors who had served in remote assignments for decades. The diplomatic correspondence that occupied significant portions of each morning demanded sophisticated understanding of international relationships that extended far beyond traditional Chinese cultural boundaries. The ongoing Korean territorial negotiations required responses that balanced historical precedents with contemporary strategic realities. Communications with Turkish tribal confederations demanded integration of military intelligence with anthropological insights and economic analysis that few court officials possessed. The policy development sessions that followed these diplomatic activities brought together Wu Zhao's comprehensive knowledge of imperial administration with specialized expertise from governmental departments, whose coordination was essential for successful implementation. These collaborative meetings consistently produced innovative solutions to complex challenges while maintaining appropriate respect for traditional procedures that retained practical value. The midday council meetings, where major imperial decisions were formalized, had been completely restructured to accommodate the collaborative partnership that had evolved between emperor and advisor during recent years. Wu Zhao would present detailed analysis of complex situations while facilitating discussions among ministers whose combined expertise covered every aspect of governmental responsibility from military strategy to economic policy. Her management of these council sessions demonstrated complete mastery of group dynamics and bureaucratic psychology that enabled decision-making processes far more effective than traditional hierarchical approaches had achieved. By encouraging genuine debate while maintaining clear authority structures, she created environments where innovative solutions emerged from collective wisdom, while ensuring that final decisions reflected comprehensive consideration of competing perspectives and long-term implications. The afternoon implementation meetings, where imperial policies were translated into specific administrative actions, had become Wu Zhao's primary venue for exercising direct oversight of governmental operations throughout Chinese territories. Department heads would present detailed execution plans, while she provided guidance about potential complications and necessary modifications that reflected her intimate understanding of regional conditions and cultural sensitivities that could affect policy outcomes. These sessions revealed how imperial administration had become entirely dependent on Wu Zhao's analytical capabilities and encyclopedic knowledge of governmental systems. Officials who had initially questioned her qualifications now automatically sought her approval for initiatives within their traditional areas of responsibility, recognizing that her insights consistently improved effectiveness while reducing costs and preventing unintended consequences that could undermine policy objectives. The late afternoon strategic planning sessions addressed fundamental challenges that would determine Chinese civilization's future stability and prosperity for generations beyond the current dynasty. Wu Zhao's participation in these discussions was establishing precedents and principles that would influence imperial governance long after present participants had completed their service to the empire. The military modernization program she had initiated were producing measurable improvements in frontier defense capabilities while creating professional officer corps whose advancement depended on demonstrated competence rather than aristocratic connections or regional loyalties. Her coordination with career soldiers who valued practical effectiveness over ceremonial tradition was generating more responsive command structures capable of adapting rapidly to changing strategic circumstances along China's extensive borders. The economic development initiatives Wu Zhao had designed throughout the empire were simultaneously increasing imperial revenues and improving living conditions for farming and artisan communities whose productivity sustained the entire governmental system. These programs demonstrated that effective imperial policy could strengthen central authority while benefiting ordinary subjects whose welfare had traditionally been sacrificed to elite interests and ceremonial expenditures. The diplomatic innovations she had introduced were producing peaceful resolutions to regional conflicts that had previously required costly military interventions with uncertain outcomes. Her negotiation methods emphasized cultural understanding and economic incentives alongside strategic firmness, creating agreements that satisfied competing interests while establishing Chinese influence through mechanisms that benefited all parties involved in complex international relationships. The evening hours brought private consultations with Emperor Gaozong that addressed both immediate policy concerns and fundamental questions about imperial succession and governmental continuity that would affect dynastic development for centuries. These intimate discussions had become the foundation for all strategic decision-making, as the emperor's increasing reliance on Wu Zhao's judgment reflected his recognition that her capabilities had become indispensable for effective imperial administration. The personal conversations that concluded each day of intensive governmental collaboration revealed how their working relationship had transcended all traditional protocols to become genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to Chinese civilization's continued prosperity. The emperor's growing dependence on Wu Zhao's analytical abilities was balanced by her absolute loyalty to their collective responsibility for maintaining imperial stability during a period of unprecedented challenges. The meditation practices that ended each day provided Wu Zhao with essential opportunities to process the enormous complexity of managing imperial administration while maintaining the emotional equilibrium necessary for sustained effectiveness under incredible pressure. The spiritual disciplines learned during her monastic years had become indispensable tools for managing stress and maintaining perspective during periods when individual decisions could affect the lives of millions throughout the known world. The evening reflections included careful assessment of Emperor Gaozong's declining health and its implications for governmental continuity during a period when external threats demanded consistent imperial leadership. Wu Zhao understood that current arrangements, however effective, represented transitional solutions that would eventually require more permanent frameworks for ensuring administrative stability and policy consistency during the inevitable imperial succession. The winter months brought formal recognition through official channels that governmental systems developed during recent years represented permanent changes to imperial administration rather than temporary expedients. Wu Zhao's authority over policy development and implementation was being acknowledged, while careful attention was paid to maintaining ceremonial protocols that preserved appropriate respect for established traditions and dynastic legitimacy. The daily schedules that had emerged required Wu Zhao to balance multiple competing demands while maintaining careful attention to the emperor's condition that enabled their continued collaboration. Morning medical consultations with imperial physicians had become regular components of her routine as she worked to ensure that health limitations did not compromise governmental effectiveness or create opportunities for political exploitation by hostile factions. The correspondence management that consumed increasing portions of her daily activities included sensitive communications reflecting the empire's complete dependence on her strategic insights and analytical capabilities. Provincial administrators throughout Chinese territories submitted reports directly to her for preliminary review, recognizing that her interpretations were essential for effective policy implementation and successful outcomes in their respective regions. The coordination meetings where governmental departments synchronized their activities had become systematic planning sessions, ensuring imperial policies were implemented consistently across vast geographical distances and diverse local circumstances. Wu Zhao's oversight of these processes created administrative effectiveness exceeding anything achieved by previous imperial systems, while establishing new standards for governmental competence that would influence Chinese administration for centuries. The relationships she had cultivated with reform-minded officials throughout the imperial system were creating political coalitions, supporting comprehensive administrative modernization, while maintaining respect for traditional practices, retaining practical value. These alliances provided essential support for innovations, challenging established precedents, while demonstrating measurable benefits, justifying departures from conventional approaches to governmental organization and policy implementation. The spring brought unprecedented opportunities for Wu Zhao to demonstrate leadership capabilities, extending beyond administrative competence to encompass vision and strategic thinking, necessary for addressing fundamental challenges facing Chinese civilization. The policies she developed were establishing frameworks for continued innovation and adaptation that would influence imperial governance for centuries, while creating models for effective leadership transcending traditional social limitations and cultural restrictions. The success of her governmental innovations was creating expectations for greater responsibilities that would test every skill she had developed, while requiring capabilities no previous Chinese leader had been called upon to demonstrate. Daily management of imperial administration had become preparation for challenges demanding not just excellence in existing systems, but wisdom and courage necessary for creating entirely new approaches to governmental authority and social organization. The morning preparations now included reviews of succession planning documents addressing the unprecedented nature of Wu Zhao's position within imperial hierarchy and its implications for dynastic continuity. Legal frameworks and ceremonial protocols required for formalizing her authority were being developed through careful study of historical precedents and innovative interpretations of traditional governmental procedures that had never contemplated female imperial authority. The intelligence networks providing comprehensive situation reports had expanded to include sources within every significant administrative center throughout the empire and neighboring kingdoms. This systematic awareness of conditions throughout Chinese territories and international relationships enabled Wu Zhao to anticipate challenges and opportunities that less informed officials could not recognize until circumstances had crystallized into situations requiring immediate responses and decisive action. The correspondence arriving each morning included communications from foreign courts, increasingly recognizing Wu Zhao as the primary architect of Chinese policy, despite her formerly subordinate position within traditional imperial hierarchy. Diplomatic representatives were requesting private audiences with her, alongside ceremonial meetings with established officials, acknowledging political realities that had not yet received official recognition through formal governmental channels or dynastic protocols. The policy development sessions had evolved into comprehensive strategic planning meetings, addressing challenges requiring integration of military, diplomatic, economic, and administrative considerations across timeframes extending far beyond immediate concerns. Wu Zhao's contributions consistently provided insights enhancing governmental effectiveness, while establishing sustainable frameworks for addressing similar challenges that would inevitably arise throughout the empire's future development. The implementation oversight had become direct management of governmental operations, extending throughout the Chinese administrative system, from the imperial capital to remote frontier outposts along dangerous borders. Her authority over policy execution was so comprehensive that department heads throughout the empire coordinated activities through her office, rather than following traditional bureaucratic channels that had proven inadequate for achieving desired outcomes efficiently. The evening strategic assessments concluding each day of governmental activity provided opportunities for Wu Zhao to evaluate progress toward long-term objectives, while identifying necessary adjustments that would improve policy effectiveness and administrative efficiency. These reflective practices had become essential components of her approach to imperial governance, while preparing her for responsibilities that would soon exceed anything previously attempted by any Chinese ruler throughout the empire's extensive history. The woman who had systematically transformed herself from merchant's daughter to indispensable governmental leader was preparing for challenges requiring every capability she had developed, while demanding innovations no previous emperor had conceived possible. The intelligence, determination, and comprehensive understanding that had brought her to this unprecedented position would soon be tested in ways determining not just her personal destiny, but the future direction of Chinese imperial development and the fundamental nature of governmental authority itself. The daily rhythms that had evolved during her years of service had become the foundation for administrative effectiveness, exceeding anything achieved by previous imperial governments while establishing new standards for governmental competence and policy innovation that would influence Chinese civilization for generations. Each morning brought opportunities to demonstrate capabilities justifying her expanding authority, while each evening provided time for reflection and planning that prepared her for the ultimate transformation rapidly approaching. And so, as the candles flicker low and the night embraces us, we reach the end of Wu Zetian's extraordinary transformation, from powerless teenager to China's only female emperor. Through palace intrigue, monastic contemplation, and unprecedented political maneuvering, she achieved what seemed impossible, reshaping an empire through intelligence, patience, and unwavering determination. Her legacy reminds us that even the most rigid traditions can bend before exceptional vision and skillful action. Rest well, knowing that sometimes the most remarkable journeys begin with a single morning's quiet resolve to change everything.